Okay. So a very good afternoon to everyone. On behalf of Speaking from Margin, I extend a heartfelt welcome to you all to the Academic Lecture Series 2025. I'm Akanksha, and it's my privilege to moderate today's discussion. Speaking from Margin is an academic platform for research scholars, socio-political activists, and students to engage with contemporary discourses in social sciences. It attempts to build academic solidarities for achieving social justice in higher education. We use this space to build solidarity among researchers from various marginal locations to engage with evolving knowledge paradigms within social sciences. In the past, we have organized several lectures and book discussions which have received overwhelming responses from the academic community and beyond. Our past speakers include Professor Kancha Alaya, Professor Rajiv Bhargav, Professor Nivedita Menon, Professor Nandini Sundar, Professor Satish Deshpande, Professor Neera Chandok, among several others. So today's lecture is titled Unbelonging is Method, Diffusing Neutrality in Transnational Research. And today we have with us two very esteemed guests for our session. It is an honor to introduce our chair for the session, Professor Nasreen Chowdhory. Nasreen Chowdhory is a professor in the Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. She received her PhD in Political Science from McGill, Canada. She has contributed to various journals and books, including Journal of Borderland Studies, International Journal of Migration and Border Studies, and Citizenship Studies, Refugee Watch, among several others. Some of her significant publications include Refugees, Citizenship and Belonging, A Contested Terrain, and the edited volumes include Deterritorialized Identities and Transborder Movements in South Asia with Nasruddin, Citizenship, Nationalism and Refugeehood of Rohingyas in Southern Asia with Biswajit Mohanty, and Gender Identity and Migration in India with Paula Banerjee. Her forthcoming work is titled New Frontiers in the Register of Migration and Refugee Studies. Formerly, she was the Vice President of IASFM and MC.
Akanksha, you muted. Yeah.
Was I muted the whole time? Okay. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sanam Roohi. Dr. Roohi is a researcher at Center for Modern Indian Studies, University of Göttingen. Her work explores caste-class higher education intersections, migration infrastructures, transnational political mobilization, and feminist peace. She had held various prestigious fellowships and won competitive grants. Previously, she was a visiting research fellow at the University of Sussex School of Global Studies and worked as an assistant professor at St. Joseph's University, Bangalore. Her publications appear in prestigious journals, and she's currently working on a book tentatively titled In Pursuit of the American Dream, Techno-Capitalist Morality and the Transnational Reproduction of Caste. We welcome you, ma'am. So before we begin the session, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of the format for today's session. So we'll start with some remarks from our chair, Professor Chowdhury, which would be followed by a 30 to 40-minute talk by a speaker, Dr. Roohi, and followed by the Q&A. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. And I'm so happy to see you, Sanam, if I may say Sanam to you, I know because we go a long way. And but let me just, without taking too much time, thank you for the Speaking from the Margin team. I think you guys do commendable work, so it's worth the wait. Let's put it this way. And I can vouch for a fact that Sanam belongs to the CRG fraternity, so it will be worth the wait. Considering I've seen her evolution as a scholar, and also I think where she is, it's a very proud moment to be associated with. So I think belonging is a very important area that is being discussed, debated, and it's about time. And I'm happy to see such a huge number of colleagues here. So over to you, Sanam. I leave you to meander your way around, and I'm very happy to be here. And thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. So shall I start, Akanksha? Yeah. Okay.
Sure, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So no, I have only one word to begin with, and that is my deepest apology for really screwing up with the time. Somehow I just put 4 p.m. CET in my calendar. I'm really sorry about that. Anyway, having said that, I want to echo what Nasreen just now said. A big thank you to the team speaking from the margin for inviting me for this really, really important and critical platform. Like her, I'm also watching the kind of work that you guys have been doing. And I must say that you've created a very important platform where you bring all big and small names alike and for further critical inquiry into many things that affect us, all of us who are present here today. And of course, thank you very much, Nasreen. I will also call you Nasreen for chairing this talk. We know each other for almost 2 decades now. And of course, because of our CRG connection. And I'm glad that we can share this platform. I think in approximately 40 minutes from now, I hope both of us can have a sort of a short, productive discussion. And then, of course, I can take questions from the rest of the attendees. I'm particularly appreciative, and I want to mention Vidya Sagar for not just the invite, but for also prodding me to speak on this specific topic, unbelonging as method, refusing neutrality in transnational research. So I've been working on this talk for the last couple of weeks now, not so much writing as much as thinking, deeply thinking about all these terms that are there, belonging and unbelonging, refusal, and above all, the question of transnationality and method. So while you gave me this topic, Vidya Sagar, I've been a little bit flexible with my approach here. And what I will try to do is bring my insights from the different kinds of fields that I straddle. First, geographically, South Asia and now Europe. Also, discipline-wise, anthropology. And thematically, I work on largely migration studies. So I'll draw upon from these different fields in this talk. And what I will also be doing is centering belonging and unbelonging in not just academia, but also higher education, because I've realized that you cannot really separate the two. Because both higher education and academia are imagined as an inclusive space. But we all know in reality, they often create and recreate every conceivable boundaries that are known to us. Anyway, I'm very, very much appreciative and also deeply sorry again appreciative of the impulse to turn the lens on belonging and its other on its head. And I think it's quite a productive and generative way to think of it as a methodological tool. So when I end, I would also like to prod Vidya Sagar back and ask him what made him really think about this particular topic. I would really be intrigued to know more. So I propose this lecture as simultaneously a thought exercise because I have too many thoughts that I've tried to put in somewhat coherently today in this talk, but also an intervention to unbox belonging and unbelonging in all its complexity and see where refusing neutrality can take us, not just in transnational research, although I will sort of bring that to the fore, but also academia in general. Now, we all know, each one of us here know, belonging is a multidimensional construct. Yes, of course, it is a construct that encompasses both subjective feelings of attachment and objective sociopolitical inclusion within specific spatial, social, and institutional contexts. So think about ourselves, all of us. We belong to particular castes, class, gender position that has been often imposed on us. It was not of our choosing. But sometimes we may accept these imposed categories or reject them, or sometimes even strategically use them. But then there are other things we belong to. We belong to towns and cities, universities and countries. And then there are spaces where we are supposed to belong, like a home or a country, for example, but we may not. Think about a violent home, which may not be a safe space as it is touted to be for people experiencing violence in their own homes, or even a country where a minority may be facing persecution. So really, it is a very nebulous concept. At the same time, we cannot just throw it away by saying it's too nebulous. It has a temporal dimension. And you may think of something you belong to today, but after years, you may not belong to it anymore. Scholars across disciplines, from migration studies, anthropology, feminist geography, and even psychology, because after all, belonging has a very strong affective dimension, they have theorized belonging in its various hues and forms. They all tend to agree that belonging is a dynamic process shaped by power relations rather than a static condition of membership. We all know belonging operates through intersecting axes of identity, as I said again, often imposed identities of race, class, caste, gender, and citizenship, but it is also very often and unfortunately contingent on recognition by dominant groups, institutions, and states. So they tell you, okay, you are a minority, or they tell you this is your religion and you belong to it. While formal legal statuses like citizens, migrants, refugees, borrowing from my research on migration studies, may grant some people different kinds of rights. You're a refugee, therefore you have certain rights, humanitarian rights, but not citizenship rights. But then there are also other forms of affective belonging that often hinges on everyday practices, narratives, and embodied experiences that defy fixed exclusionary boundaries, as Sarah Ahmed tells us. So there's always this tension, between fixed categories and everyday practices of belonging. Despite this, belonging is weaponized to exclude any group considered the other by the dominant, exposing the tension between state imposed categories and socially imposed categories and norms. Think of being an upper caste, what being a lower caste look like. These are all imposed categories and norms. Think of gendered norms and performances. And of course, the lived realities of belonging and unbelonging are inflected by all of these categories and layers. Therefore, as I already sort of very quickly laid out, belonging is a site of both oppression but also a terrain of struggle, where an increasingly interconnected world that we live in, as transnational subjects, negotiate our fractured senses of belonging across borders, cultures, and epistemologies. I want to briefly turn to the work of Professor Joanna Favre-Zarneska. In her research, in her article actually, Multiple Belonging and the Challenges to Biographic Navigation, she alerts us to the distinction between belonging with and belonging to. And I think that is quite a productive way of looking at things, although it may seem very like a binary, but it is not. It is actually a kind of, how do I put it, analytical categories more than binaries, and how each represent or reflect two contrasting paradigms. So we have to always understand that we always sort of straddle between these two things of belonging with and belonging to. Belonging with draws from communitarian thought, emphasizing collective norms, shared identities, and the role of social boundaries in shaping us. This is our nation, and that is Pakistan, things like this. This perspective underscores the enduring influence of communal ties and then the ways they are enforcing solidarity and exclusion. Again, think of national belonging. However, as Zygmunt Bauman had argued more than a decade ago, collectivities no longer hold this kind of absolute control over their members' allegiances. In an increasingly interconnected world, many of us are mobile, some of us are migrants. We navigate multiple affiliations in groups, whether defined by tradition, ethnicity, or ideology, but also contend with overlapping loyalties, even when the gatekeepers, they resist such fluidity. They don't like fluidity. But there are many of us who resist being boxed into a category by using our agency to either belong to or not, and not just belong with. Now, despite its increasingly fractured reality that I have actually brought to the fore, I would also like to say that belonging is therefore not something that we can just brush away with, because this is where psychologists come. They will tell you that belonging is a very fundamental human motivation and driver. Now, there's a book by Baumeister and Leary, a psychology book that actually has thousands and thousands of citations, which actually talks about belonging as this very primary form of motivation for humans. How do people, many of us, I imagine, who may not belong to dominant categories, are then collectively and structurally deprived of our motivation and drive in academia, where the dominant categories and structures are very much in power? How do we position ourselves, our marginal and peripheral selves, to this academic setting to make place for ourselves, no matter how small, to make place for our viewpoint and the stories of our communities? In this talk, in this remainder of the talk, I speak not only from my experience as a first-generation graduate, a Muslim-born woman raised and educated in India, and currently a precarious and mobile researcher in Europe, lest I be bracketed for making unscientific and emotional claims, but I draw upon my 15 years of PhD and postdoc research working on high-skilled STEM graduates and how they reproduce caste in the Indian diaspora, My engagement in the last 4 years with the higher education landscape, particularly of Europe, as part of a working group leader of a cost action, where I look at inequalities through my working group, and also finally through another project that I'm working on with colleagues, where we look at migrant and marginalized academics and how they try to create a digital footprint for themselves. Now, based on these works, I will be making 3 interrelated interjections in the remainder of the talk in an attempt to answer the question that I just raised. How do we make place for ourselves, our viewpoints, and the stories of our communities as marginalized scholars or scholars who are not at the core but at the periphery of academia? First, I will start with political economy because I think structures are very important. They shape us to a large extent, and we have to contend with the neoliberal academia that we all are part of, arguing that it relies on the academic labor of marginalized scholars and academics and students. So I do that first, talk about the political economy, extractive political economy. Then I delve a little bit more on the politics of belonging, but also representation, because you cannot just talk about belonging without talking about representation in academia. And the whole myth of neutrality is busted when we look at critical research on this area. And finally, using critical scholarship and feminist methodologies, I explore how can we, scholars from marginalized backgrounds, can mount a response to the extractive global academia and use belonging as well as its other unbelonging as a methodological tool. So let me quickly turn to the political economy of neoliberal universities. Now, I ask all of you to just take a moment and imagine any brochure of a university or even a college you might have come across, or any university you might have looked up. Okay, just for a moment, think about it. What comes to your mind? Perhaps what comes to your mind is students and faculty of different backgrounds, happy and harmonious in their environment. The neoliberal university is projected as an open and inclusive, if somewhat meritorious place. But in reality, it operates as a market-driven institution, prioritizing efficiency, competition, and increasingly, as we know, privatization over what could have been the core academic values, which is critical inquiry, collective knowledge production. Under this neoliberal model, and I understand that there is a push to this neoliberal model from what people are calling post-liberal turn, with the coming of people like Trump, who are trying to make education a scarce resource, and they work under very, very well-defined national parameters, higher education only for our own, not for outsiders. I understand these impulses, but they have just started. And therefore, our university projects are still very much neoliberal. So I'm contending with that this neoliberal model of education and research commodifies students, frame them as consumers, frames degrees as investments in future earnings, investments in future earnings. And the research that is done is actually done to make capitalism and status quo thrive. In such a setting, we all know STEM education is prioritized. Think of all the money that is being spent in India. Where is it going in higher education? Most of it is going in STEM. And marginalizing of humanities and critical scholarship then becomes a result of this very skewed approach. Now, we who are anyway from our peripheral spaces, who are also not part of STEM, I think most of us at least are not. Where do we stand within this neoliberal academic setup? I contend that while we are at the periphery, we are also very important to its sustenance. The neoliberal academia is built on the backs of the academics and intellectual labor of marginalized students and academics. Operating within a classed, racialized, and caste-inflected political economy, it extracts the intellectual and physical labor. Sometimes we keep forgetting how much physical labor goes into running of universities. Apart from that, intellectually, this is done in various forms. We all know about it, borrowing the empirics from the marginalized for theorizing by the hegemonic dominant, making use of the marginalized as native informants, appropriating local knowledge without crediting its origin, etc., etc. What about hard sciences? I'm not very sure about the labs in India, but in the West, if you just peek into any labs, you'll see that it is run by people of color, all STEM labs, PhDs and postdocs, most of them Asian. The political economy of neoliberal or trying to turn to post-liberal academia thrives on the exploited labor of marginalized, either scholars or otherwise, who are systematically undervalued, yet essential to sustaining the market-driven model. Now, let me briefly talk about the West. Here, institutions commodify diversity. It's a very big thing. Every university wants to talk about diversity and inclusivity, but we know that it's just a branding tool. They actually provide precarious employment like adjunctification. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about 0-hour contracts. That means you get a contract to teach 0 hours, which means they can ask you whenever and wherever to come and teach, and you just have to be there. Absolutely shameful. Short-term contracts, unequal pays, disproportionately burdening women, scholars of color, and those from the global south. While these scholars are focusing on decolonial, feminist, and critical racial studies, race studies, these are very important topics in the West now. They're appropriated from these marginalized scholars to legitimize academia's progressive facade, even as these scholars face institutional barriers to tenure, funding, and leadership role. Now, this is with regard to the Western academia. What about India? We see a sort of a similar trope playing out with regard to SC, ST, and BC students and faculty. And here I'm reminded of the work by Professor Vivek Kumar, who critiqued the entrenched dominance of twice-born upper castes in Indian sociology, his discipline, arguing that the discipline, despite its 100 years history, remain exclusionary and hierarchical. While British, European, and American intellectual influences have been acknowledged, the caste-based hegemony within Indian sociology has largely been ignored. That is his argument, and rightly so. But I'm very sure we can make similar arguments about all the disciplines in India. Veiling structural exclusion and prolonged precarity in the garb of providing opportunity, academia here in Europe or the US or anywhere, even in India, they incorporate students and academics from the marginalized communities only peripherally, finding their situated knowledge very useful, their labor very useful, but in a very ad hoc manner. This form of academic extractivism, of course, mirrors colonial extraction, you can say. This dynamic reinforces an academic caste system, not just in India, but also abroad. Marginalized scholars sustain the foundation of the institutions, while administrative and intellectual elites and corporate-aligned research priorities reap the material benefit. So, belonging in this kind of a neoliberal academic setup, of course, would be particularly fraught for marginalized scholars due to such structural contradictions, that demand their labor while denying them institutional power. Therefore, belonging becomes a kind of a paradox. These kind of scholars, marginalized from marginal backgrounds, are hyper-visible, so it's not that they will not be visible. They're hyper-visible even if their numbers are low. They become systematically the face of inclusivity, but actually they are excluded from material conditions and decision-making power. Now, what can we, many of us, belonging to these liminal categories and always straddling a sense of belonging and unbelonging, do epistemologically and methodologically? Now, in this second part, I contend that belonging and unbelonging and the related questions of representation and neutrality are not merely existential conditions, but methodological and epistemological sites of knowledge production. And it is in this generative site we have to turn our focus on, our collective focus on. So briefly now, I will speak about neutrality and representation in academia. Feminist scholars have for decades, been telling us that the myth of neutrality, objective research, they've critiqued all this, arguing that all inquiry is situated within power structures that dictates who belong and who does not in political and social spaces. Similarly, by the same logic, it can dictate who belong or does not belong in academic spaces. But despite the decade of critical scholarship, the idea of neutrality persists. All of us who are working in European academia, we know that there are certain research and languages that are deemed scientific, therefore neutral, and certain other languages and researches that are deemed unscientific, therefore non-neutral. Now, by centering belonging and unbelonging as methodological tools, Researchers like us can use our strategic and situated agency to expose the hierarchies embedded in transnational knowledge production, particularly because I come from migration studies in the contexts where borders, either physical, epistemic, or ideological, dictate legitimacy. Who is legitimate and who is not? What is legitimate and what is not? So, further going into transnational migration research, let me talk about how human mobility for long has been framed ostensibly in neutral, objective lenses. And now I also speak as the editor in chief of a journal of migration. And oh man, does it really have a hold? So there's always this imperative and impulse, especially in Europe, to study migration through a neutral, scientific, or even statistical lens, with state-imposed categories that are taken as a given and hardly ever questioned. But that doesn't mean that there is no research to counter it. Indeed, in the last 20 years, there is a lot of research on transnationalism particularly. There are scholars like Peggy Levitt, Aisha Kaglar, Nina Glick-Schiller, Kevin Dunn, Parvati Raghuram, who have focused on embodied transnationalism, advocating for a shift in migration studies from abstract flows to the lived experiences of migrants. And here I also want to talk about CRG, where I started my career after my master's, and the vast corpus of research they have done, challenging these kind of very scientific and statistical way of looking at migration. They've critiqued these people as well as organizations like CRG, earlier research for overemphasizing mobility and neglecting how bodies, shaped by caste, race, gender, disability, place, etc., navigate transnational spaces unevenly. They suggest that border dynamics alter everyday aspirations, imaginations, and decision making while redefining notions of belonging and nationality. These critical scholars have shifted the focus from abstract theories of migration to the material, affective, and sometimes oppressive realities of transnational life, offering critical insights into how migrants negotiate belonging, agency, and structural violence in their daily existence, and sometimes what have been called as slow violence or invisible violence in their daily existence. Increasingly, more critical scholars of migration are advocating for decolonial methodologies that center marginalized voices as legitimate knowers rather than mere subjects of study. But then the anthropologist in me tells me that while migration study may have come to this only recently in the last 10, 15, 20 years, there have been a huge corpus of scholarship that existed much before it. If we look at anthropology itself, I'm reminded of Leela Abu-Lughod's essay, Can There Be a Feminist Ethnography?, where she proposed, of course, that feminist ethnography is and should be a practice of destabilizing boundaries. Drawing on her fieldwork with Bedouin women, Abu-Lughod argued that feminists like herself, who's also a Hafsi, who's culturally a hybrid, by embracing our multiple subjectivities, we can disrupt the self-other binary central to anthropology's colonial roots. In migration studies, as I said, feminist methodologies are increasingly gaining ground despite the rigidity of neutrality and state categories. And these feminist methodologies have prioritized narrative and participatory method to amplify marginalized voices. This epistemological shift exposes how state and institutional categories are constructed, often in simplistic binary opposition all the time, legal, illegal. Think about all the debates happening in India about Bangladeshis, migrants and citizens, to enforce exclusion. If we think alongside these feminist scholars, we can argue that neutrality, objectivity, and truth as received knowledge of the infallibility of the state and the state-imposed categories is actually a myth. Feminist pedagogies and epistemologies urge us to transform belonging and unbelonging, especially to state-imposed categories, from passive and given into active methodologies, enabling critical engagement with things like migration, research topics like displacement, or even things like resistance. Researchers like us can refuse neutrality explicitly, centering our positionality in a neither purely subversive way, like I'm going to be very subversive. It doesn't have to be that, nor in the entirely conformist way to challenge oppressive frameworks. we can actually bring our stories to the fore by using our agency, strategic and located agency, situated agency. We occupy a unique epistemic position that enables us to challenge hegemonic knowledge systems through our lived experiences of perhaps some of us of displacement, hybridity, border crossing, to produce knowledge that can also be comparative, that can also be interdisciplinary, but simultaneously be attuned to power asymmetries. But as we do that, as we, center our own positionalities, I also want to alert us. We become representatives of the communities whose stories we tell and carry a huge responsibility. There is some research on the politics of representation. So the moment I strategically use my background as a Muslim woman, for example, or as a migrant scholar in Europe, for example, I have to understand that it is not just about me anymore, that I become a representative. And the politics of representation in academic research is deeply intertwined with questions of epistemic justice, as marginalized communities have historically and traditionally been excluded from both the production and dissemination of knowledge. Traditional research paradigms, often shaped by dominant social groups, tend to reinforce and reinforce hegemonic narratives, while rendering subaltern perspectives as almost invisible or even aberrant. That is not the norm, it's aberrant. This exclusion is not merely methodological, but ideological. And I mentioned about Professor Kumar's work on Brahminical domination of Indian sociology. But then we can go back to the work of Spivak, going back to many decades, who talk about Eurocentric framings of history. Now, the ethical imperative extends beyond inclusion. It demands from us a radical reconfiguration of why we are speaking, for whom we are speaking, and whom we are citing, and whose epistemologies are we validating. Dalit feminists like Sharmila Rege have challenged caste-blind sociology for foregrounding oral histories and grassroots movements as theoretical interventions. Similarly, indigenous scholars in Latin America and Africa, there are many to name here, have argued that research must serve liberation, not extraction. They must prioritize communal sovereignty over academic voyeurism. Representation, then, it's not just about visibility or we becoming the speakers of our community, but epistemic redistribution that dismantles the hierarchies that dictate which knowledge counts as rigorous, universal, or worthy of abstraction. So I'm also reminded of another old anthropological work, again, as a gentle reminder to my fellow migration scholars, but to all of us, by How Native is a Native Anthropologist by Kiran Narayan. So this was again written based on her work in the 80s, early 1990s, this article that I'm talking about, also a book chapter by the same name. Kiran Narayan challenges the rigid binary between native and non-native anthropologists, arguing that all anthropologists operate within complex, shifting identities shaped by class, gender, race, education, caste, transnational experiences. She doesn't mention caste, but I am mentioning that. She critiqued the essentialist assumption that if we are native, we somehow inherently possess authenticity, while outsiders are condemned to perpetual otherness. Now, why am I bringing this complex paper, book, or chapter by Kiran Narayan is because I think it is an important interjection about belonging and non-belonging. So she made important interjections by rejecting romanticized notion of native authenticity. Just because we belong to a particular group, or at least strategically bring that belonging to the fore, it doesn't mean that we somehow have authentic knowledge. What I'm trying to say is that we should also look inward, be very reflexive, and not just take it as a given that we have somehow the complete authority over particular kinds of knowledges that are being produced by the groups we belong to, or at least claim to belong to. So, as sociologists and anthropologists studying our own communities, we should be aware of the complex power dynamics, even if we may not totally agree with Kiran Narayan about insiders and outsiders in anthropology. We should be aware of the complex power dynamics and cultural distances as we become the representatives and interlocutors for our community. Very briefly, so what is the way forward then? A refusal to neutrality demands transformative methodologies that reject extractive research models. Feminist transnational research have increasingly, and I'm talking about the scholarship that has come out in the last 10 years or so, relational ethics, where participants are co-theorists rather than subjects. Embodied knowledge, where emotions and lived experiences are valid data and not just something to be rejected as unscientific. In studies of migrant domestic workers by a scholar who I'm really, I look up to her work, Paranias, she refuses neutrality and involves her own subjects who are domestic Filipino workers living and working abroad, often in Gulf, but now in America as well. So what all this entails are some form of epistemic disobedience, rejecting research that demands they serve some kind of border regimes. And these borders don't actually have to be the actual borders between countries, but we know that borders can emerge in many ways and in different forms. So what do we do? For example, you can do epistemic disobedience, and it's a very big thing actually in our field of research, especially in Europe, because a lot of research on migration that is produced then goes to the state, who then use it against the migrants. So we can practice epistemic disobedience by not sharing our data with immigrant authorities, for example, even if we are asked to. I'm not asked because I don't do that kind of research, but then those who do, they can. We can foreground care and accountability to transform and use feminist methodologies to transform research into a site of solidarity, challenging the reproduction and continuous reproduction rather of the coloniality of knowledge production, where the center and periphery always is reproduced in so many shapes, so many forms. We just have to have a critical eye to find that. So, finally, I would say belonging and unbelonging, when wielded as feminist methods, exposes the fracture in dominant knowledge systems. But that is where the generative potential lies. It challenges the very logic, insisting that the margins are where the most urgent truths emerge, like Paranias's work on Filipino domestic workers in the Gulf or in the US. By embracing relationality, refusal, and embodied knowledge, researchers like us, who may not completely belong to the academia, neoliberal dominant academia, or belong to dominant positions within those academias, can turn our experiences of liminal belonging or unbelonging into a transformative praxis. With that, I thank all of you for listening to me. And once again, I deeply apologize for the delay.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such a rich and resonant lecture. I invite Professor Chowdhury for her comments before we proceed for the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Roohi. Yeah, it's a very interesting conversation that is much overdue. And I'm kind of reminded of my classroom in Delhi University, where for the first, I won't say first time, but when the idea of belonging was being probed and discussed, and it was a while back, so which basically means that I'm getting older. And yeah, that's okay. But what is critical is to understand the lens of belonging. And I think what Dr. Roohi was able to do was kind of, draw the nitty-gritty of the multidimensional aspect of what belonging is through various, lenses, which is very much, interdisciplinary in nature. And that actually needs to be understood in a context to suggest that what exactly belonging means to whom. And I think that has been done quite well to figure out, what belonging is. Belonging as a concept has become one of the areas where it's been cross-disciplinary work is being done. across, like, it's no longer just part of anthropology or sociology or psychology. It's very much in the domain of anything. That's why I see, the idea of belonging there, being probed from various, ways. So what is critical is to understand, I think what I particularly liked is Dr. Rui's understanding of, understanding as a method. And particularly, I'm again, biased to the idea of, feminist understanding of method in terms of understanding what it means to belong. And I'm kind of reminded of Paula's work, who has for the longest time really said that, without agency, you can't talk about it. So there's nothing called neutrality in research. There should never be anything about, there's no research can be neutral. And as subjects, we have the capacity and the legitimacy and the agency to draw that out very, very critically. And I think you've done an excellent work. I mean, despite, the wait was worth it, I would definitely say that. So 3 key takeaways. One is, you probe the question of belonging and you juxtapose it against unbelonging. And I did not hear much about unbelonging as a category, as a construct, but I can understand where it is emerging from. So, in terms of method, is unbelonging being juxtaposed as an emancipatory concept where there's an assumption that belonging is static? And when we basically say belonging by whom and to what, I would say, because for the longest time and still now, belonging is a very, very status concept. So there is a plethora of scholars in Global South who has been working really, really long enough to understand what does belonging mean for a migrant community who kind of walked all the way in the 2020, a pandemic, when they were following the railway track to reach home. So is it that because they were belonging less there, or were they feeling a sense of belonging that they would feel at home? So that's one takeaway that I would like to kind of highlight. So how do we then juxtapose the idea of unbelonging as a tool, and whether unbelonging needs to be unpacked a little more, taking it away from the mirror image of belonging itself? The second point, I think, which I particularly liked is, which came towards the end, is where you give a way forward, in terms of understanding refusal and, academic disobedience on a level where, which I think is very, very important to be reminded of, where the data is being shared again by the state towards a particular gain. So again, that is a neoliberal understanding of it, and that's how it is supposed to function. So again, as commodified, academic labor, I'm not saying migrant, because as academic labor, where does this all, add up to? Where does it go from here? Is there a way forward, literally? Can we really think of that? And the third point that, again, which I wish you had elaborated, because you brought in a word called care and accountability. Much has been written on the question of care, and care is actually not a political term. It's not a sociological term. It's actually a psychological term which has been appropriated, right? Or a medical term, some would even say, right? So sometimes what happens is, when we talk about concepts do get entangled in a particular domain, and perhaps that needs to be teased out a little more. But with these words, I would say much, gratitude to not only for speaking from the margin, but also to Dr. Roohi for this opportunity. Because I think everybody who's here, they're all intrigued by the concept of belonging. And I can say firsthand, because I have seen them evolve right before me. So it's very important that you're playing a very, very critical role in that, in their, growth. So thank you so much. And I think with that, we can open the floor for questions. Yeah.
I would request you to either write your questions in the chat box or raise your hand. And please keep your questions brief. Thank you.
So may I suggest that I actually maybe start responding to Nasreen, and then maybe,
Sure, ma'am. Sure. Yeah.
Think a little bit more and think along with me, and then maybe come up with some questions. So Thank you so much for your interjections, Nasreen, of course. Yes, it is a multidimensional concept, belonging is, and that's why I tried in the first part of my lecture to bring about some kind of nuance to the idea that it is not just about state-imposed categories, going back to Professor Joanna Fav's work, where she talks about belonging with and belonging to as a kind of an analytical, even if binary tool to understand how there are certain concepts of belonging that are given, but also there are certain senses of belonging we make as we go along. So having said that, I think, yes, of course, Dr. Professor Paula Banerjee's work on agency and refusal of neutrality is also important. That's why I mentioned, I mean, CRG has produced so much scholarship that I think if any one of you is working on migration or displacement should definitely look up Calcutta Research Group and the kind of work they've done. And yeah, so talking about your first takeaway about the juxtaposition, and I think you are very right because the unbelonging was sort of was left to be deciphered. And we talked about belonging, and even if it was not left to be deciphered, maybe in my interjections, I took unbelonging as a kind of a mirror image. You are right. But if belonging is so complex, therefore unbelonging also is there. But I do not say that I did not deal with it completely because it was there in bits and pieces all throughout. And that is what I was saying. Sometimes the refusal even to belong, like, you know, to a home, a violent home that I mentioned, or to a country where you don't belong because you're a minority and it's persecuting people who look like you or who believe like you. So sometimes maybe unbelonging is a form of refusal that we actively, agentially take. But unbelonging is also imposed on us by the status quoist, by the statist norms and categories. So forever, I mean, I have been living in Germany for now 7 years. I am always a migrant because every time I go to renew my visa, I'm reminded that I'm a migrant, and it happens like 2-3 times a year. So because of my precarious nature, so sometimes I have a contract, sometimes I don't. So you know, I keep, so even though I don't want to be, but there is this critical literature in, thankfully, again, very new scholarship emerging in Europe about migrantification. So you know, then I feel like, okay, the state migrantifies me in Europe in particular ways, and I'm always reminded of that. They will not let me forget. So then unbelonging can be done by the state through its various coercive and not so coercive mechanisms. And I'm glad you really, really brought this point out. I need to think a little bit more. But as I said in the beginning of my talk, last 2 weeks I've been thinking about, and I've been thinking too much about it, and I've been thinking too many things about it because it's a very rich, I mean, I want to ask Vidyasagar, why did he come up with this title? Because I'm very intrigued. I thought it was very interesting. And of course, it was very, very important. But as I said, this is a thought exercise. It's not a very, very coherent and well thought out talk. But I'm glad that I did it. And I'm again really, really very sorry that I was late for 15 minutes.
No, I think you've apologized enough, if I may say so, on behalf of the. I shouldn't, but
Okay, now I won't.
it's really worth it. Yeah, but I think if I can exert my power of being the chair a little and extend this conversation till you come up with your questions, I think unbelonging is a very important tool.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
by juxtaposing it against belonging itself, it kind of does a bit of a disservice. So what I was trying to get at is, I mean, it's evolving, so that's okay. But this idea of precarity, and which I have read your work, which was shared by Shamota a long time back. I think this came out during COVID 2022, the work that, where all of you came together, where you wrote, precariat, migrant marginality or something like that. I mean, where all of you came together and wrote. But I think when we talk about unbelonging, it's a very important concept that needs to be really, really extrapolated and perhaps needs to be teased out a little more. Because that is something that is just not in the domain of labor. It is there in the domain of any other aspect.
Yes, exactly.
So, and that's something, and can I just answer on behalf of, Vidyasagar, why he took this topic? Because I think he's intrigued by it. I mean, he's been intrigued by it when he was a student at Delhi University, and now he's somewhere else, which is good. So I think he's very intrigued by that, right? So okay, I'll leave it to the members to jump in now. Please raise your question, because this is a very important area, and I think I'm sure you'll hear much more from Dr. Rooh from there. Okay.
Mhm. Okay, so there is a question in the chat. Shall I read it out? Akanksha, Vidya
I'll read it out. So Swastika Sakar is asking, what factors determine whether or not migrants construct and manifest their identities in exile?
Okay. Shall I answer them?
Sure, ma'am.
Sure. Okay. So, so if I understand you correctly, Swastika, you are asking about what identities do they construct or they carry forward, and in exile, by exile, are you actually only talking about exile, or are you also talking about just migration? Because exile is something very different than just migration. So if you just talk about exile, it is not something I've worked on, but of course I'm a little bit aware of. Usually exiles are political in nature. When you go from one place to another, you have to strategically and sort of in a very essentialist way construct a particular form of identity and say that because of that identity you have been persecuted, and therefore you had to leave your homeland, your country where you were born, whose citizenship you hold, and therefore now you seek asylum in another country. And when you do that, you very much construct strategically essentializing your particular identity one over the other. But since I've been working on migration for a long time now, I've seen in the US. I'll give you one example. So here I was in the US, and there was this woman who came. She was from the dominant Kamma caste, who was, Kammas are dominant in coastal Andhra, but also Andhra in general. And she had claimed political asylum in the US. She was telling me her story. And Kammas are the dominant caste, so therefore they do not really fall under the category of asylum seekers. But there she was seeking asylum. She was telling me about all her stories of going to Mexico, traveling to, because she was in that illegal terrain, quote unquote, illegal terrain. So she was thrown out and she went to Mexico. Then she traveled back with a lot of Mexicans back to the US because she felt that she had to use asylum seeking as a mean to migrate, because there is a culture of migration in coastal Andhra. Everybody migrates and you have to migrate. There's a social push for you to migrate. And among the upper castes, it is definitely US, but also other Western countries. And among the non-dominant castes, it is the Gulf. I have worked on both these regions. So I think it is very important that we have to actually pay attention to the terms we are using. So maybe Swastika, you can tell me if you mean exile or something else.
Okay, so Ganesh, you can go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, I would like to thanks. Actually, it was a very brilliant lecture that you enlightened us with a different dimension. But yeah, since I'm working on emotions, I sometimes look at belonging in that context. But before going to ask that kind of questions, first I would like to clarify something from you,
Yeah.
particularly when you are talking about this extractive intellectual labor, right?
Mhm.
So when we are looking at the concept of labor, so I mean, how do you categorize this notion of labor when you are situating it with the academic exercise and the academic works? Because when we look at the labor, the values in the particularly what Professor Chaudhary also mentioned about the migrant laborer and all. So are you situating these values of labor in the context of quantifying amount or something else? Because when we'll keep it in the quantity context, then that will be something we are also hierarchizing labor, like intellectual labor, the labor who are engaged in the field, like doing the field particular labor construction and all these are. So this is one question. And the second one is that when you are talking about the Kiaran Narayan's work and talking the native authenticity, So in that, recently I have done my fieldwork in Uttar Pradesh, working on anger and emotion and Dalit politics and all. So I spent around 4 months there, and most of the time, at the night time, I was able to talk with more with the peoples, and I was staying there. But one things I found when I was reading the literature on the ethnography and anthropology, they spent around 1 year, 1.5 years like this long term. But I spent only 4 months. But what I felt at the 3 or 4 day only, I get this opportunity to enter their kitchen, even eating with them and all. So do you think this time limit, that is it also the set of something called colonial prejudice? Why I'm saying this, because in our center when we are doing the methodology class, some professors told that when you will not spend minimum 7 to 8 months, you will cannot call it as an work of ethnography. So but I have spent only that time, but at the 3 or 4 days only I entered to their kitchen and having very good chat with them. So how can you consider this the native authenticity or something like that? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Ma'am,
Okay.
can we take Vidyasagar's question as well?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So thank you so much, Sanam, for such a uh, astonishingly brilliant presentation talk. It seems like for me, attending a course on self-reflection in social anthropology in Germany. We do very like a regular basis about the self-reflection research, and I think many of us, I think we're going to re-listen this lecture after. I mean, like again too, because there are so much for us to think methodologically. I mean, regards to research ethics, positionality, and all. I have a series of questions, but I am going to ask only some of them, which I think I'm struggling with my own research as well, and based on your presentation. So the first question about the when you are framing this idea of unbelonging and belonging is also like part of methodology and ethics. For example, uh, generally, when we emphasize this idea of belonging, both an epistemological and also affective part of research and the kind of work we all are doing. So, how do you address these situations where I or someone do not belong fully? It's not about belonging fully or like an entirety. I belong partially.
Yes.
So, how do you address the situation where you partial belonging? For example, let's say diasporic or privileged subject or certain group or class or caste, any other identity we can add, creates a sort of ambivalence or even more complicated, complicit system of domination, whether you are conducting field work or doing some other ethnography, anthropological work. So, can unbelonging ever become a form of extractive intimacy rather than this my partially, not in terms of fully or completely absent? The second question I would like to ask, and it's also about when we, especially in completely Eurocentric university structure, where I'm also located, this question of, I think Ganesh also highlighted about this emotional labor and the question of care. So how do you suggest, on what kind of practice you can suggest for like a care or community, especially when we are ethically committed to do certain kind of research which is completely embedded in the violence and displacement and trauma, and we say and we express in our writing, like a dissertation or any academic piece you write, but when it went to review, like scientific review, and they say no, this cannot be considered a scientific practice, you cannot do that. Like, I had a course here, good scientific practice, and they said, no, you cannot do that. So how as a researcher, like as a young researcher, we all struggle with this question. Like Ganesh said, the scale of your ethnography. So what do you recommend for us to address or navigate this sort of embedded emotional things in research, which is somehow also attached to our life world, also our lived experience? Thank you.
Ma'am, would you like to answer these
Sure, sure.
questions, or should we take more? They are there in the chat.
Yeah, maybe we take the question in the chat as well, and then I can answer.
Okay, sure. So Kashyap is asking, in an era facilitated by globalized networks, what are the stiff areas within belonging? As societies gradually keep doing away with Marxist orientation and also post-revolutionary societies drifting away from the Marxist cornerstone of building up international solidarities to overthrow the world order of inequality, as well as from the original Marxist impulse of ensuring the freedom of intellectual development of the individual, what sort of challenges occur to such disciplinary framework and how do we overcome them? Then Shiv is asking that he's intrigued by the term unbelonging and he's baffled whether unbelonging may be there or not. And neutrality is somehow not possible. Scholars like Cox also say that a person is always fixed to an identity, whether he or she wants or not. People always try to know the identity and belonging of a person. Even the state also does the same through enumeration and other methods. So does unbelonging really exist, or is it just a fancy word?
Yeah. My God,
Indra
fantastic.
has a question. I think Indra, please go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello, hi. Thank you so much. It was such a informative session. I wish to get all the reading list, all the resources for my reading list as well. I think I got very intrigued with this idea. I mean, belonging itself is a very dynamic process. It evolves even within us as well. So for me, the question is in the context of in the borderland areas, how belonging also evolves when movement becomes so rampant, and also especially in when you look at the Himalayan borderlands, they are, the belonging is also simultaneously, getting involved with a lot of identity, with multiple identities that already exist, and in those, like how it becomes very important, like very difficult to also navigate one sense of belonging. And then, in terms of like navigating that, and when you say applying feminist research methodology to understand this, going and like looking at the lived realities and trying to also get the people from the marginalized communities itself to explore their own understanding of belonging. I was just like kind of thinking how sometimes it's so difficult because people from most of these communities haven't had access to even history writing for a long time, let alone being in academia. So even the, in terms of even writing a paper, being in academia, even for further education in that case. So their way of telling their own story is often very different. So then is their way of telling authentic enough? Because we're talking about authenticity as well. So because for a long time, when you look at the history writing as well, it's always often the story is told from a very privileged, class of people. Even when you look at many movements itself, people who have had access to this telling of stories. So in that manner, how will academia, or how will, like, issues like this also be very cognizant of how knowledge, like what kind of knowledge production is authentic in that sense? Because many of these communities often tell their narratives itself, because oral history telling, for instance. So right, so those are not like really looked at in a large manner. And then, so in those situations, how do we navigate and how do we understand, or like create even if you're talking about knowledge production and also knowledge produced from this community. So how, like all of this. So.
Yeah. It's a very big question. And actually, all of you have asked really large questions that take a lot of thinking, but I will try to attempt some answers to them definitely, because these are all very, very important questions, each one of it. So, yeah, I will start with Ganesh's points, okay? Talking about labor. So that is why when I said that universities, I'm not trying to hierarchize different forms of labor, because the university cannot run without physical labor. One day people just disappear, the university will stop working. People means all kinds of people. So there are different forms, and of course feminist researchers and scholars have talked about emotional and affective labor, right? So you can also think that you can maybe consider intellectual labor in that form, which may be difficult to quantify but exists, and um, and it's very crucial to, I don't know how to quantify. They are trying to quantify how much you produce, therefore I can quantify how much intellectual labor. It is not easy, right? It is not easy. It's a very difficult exercise, because that's how affective, emotional, intellectual, abstract forms of labor are. But they do exist side by side to physical labor, which I already mentioned in my talk, is very, very crucial. So we cannot hierarchize one over the other, because they are very instrumental in running an institution like a university. But at the same time, I was also very, very important point you have raised about doing field work. And now, can 4 months of field work be considered ethnographic or ethnographic enough? Now, this is you talking back to the received knowledge of what ethnography should be, because there is a received knowledge. You have to stay 1 year. I did 15 months of fieldwork because I was forced to do it. Not that I loved it, but you are doing 4 months. So maybe in those 4 months, you can gather much more nuances. It also depends on your own positionality. What if, to me, it took 6 months to even establish rapport in the field? What if? Not true. But what if? So what if you could develop rapport in 1 week? So I think this kind of rigidity that people associate with ethnography, but I think your 4 months, if I was anyway looking at your work, I would definitely say that definitely it is ethnographic as long as you have done justice to it, because ethnography is about 24/7 research. This is something that is true to ethnography. It's 24/7 research. It is sensorial. You are there, you are living there, you are living there, you are imbibing things, you are doing it. So ethnography is not just about that one interview that you have done in that day, or maybe in 1 week 2 interviews you have done. It's about 24/7 sensorial experience. So if that is ethnography, which I think it is, therefore your 4 months definitely is valid and it counts, and therefore you can respond back to whoever is saying. But you also have a way of responding. There has been a plethora of literature that came out after COVID-19 which talked about doing ethnography in a changed scenario. So look up all kinds of ethnography in a post-COVID world, during COVID, in a post-COVID world, and see. And they will have some answers, because our supervisors want proper scientific answers. So you give them the answers from those research that I'm telling you about. You look them, I don't have names immediately, but a lot of anthropologists. So just go to any anthropology journal and search. You will find they have done it. So it's about not really the quantity at the time you've spent. So I think it also answers to the questions Vidya Sagar raised about all these parameters that have been, forced on us. Now, this is what it is, and this is how it should be. About all the kinds of, but ethical questions, I think they're important. When I was a student, ethics was never discussed. I think it is an important part. We have to talk about, and that is why I was talking about Kiran Narayan. I bought Kiran Narayan for a particular way, because, there are people who will say, only I am the authentic person who can talk about this. You may have more access, you may have more knowledge, imbibed knowledge about a particular community. So nobody takes away from that. But to say only I can speak about them, I don't think that is right. And that is why I ended my talk by talking about solidarity and talking about care and scholarship of care, which of course, Nasreen, it comes from health, but now it is being used widely. And I think we all should practice scholarship of care. We all have to extend care to each other, because this is not just about this, all about me and me making my career. No, academia is not that anymore. It is changing, and we have to practice ethics of care to each other. But that doesn't mean that you should be completely paralyzed by ethics. Like sometimes it is like, there are places which will overwhelm you with ethical forms and papers that you cannot do your research. And there is something to be had, because their ethical parameters are so rigid, and so I don't know what they are coming from, where they are coming from. Sometimes I know, for example, I know my friends who have done research, they belong to a particular caste, they've worked on castes that were above them. They couldn't have had access, but they had to maybe hide their identity of being from a non-dominant caste. Now, I think in the US kind of research, that work will be completely thrown out. But I will say that is a very, very important and very, very looking up kind of a research. It's very ground up research. It's very, very important and very valid, that kind of knowledge production. But maybe in America, that will be said that you've got your data by not openly talking about your whatever, your positionality as a non-dominant caste person. But so you have to, but ethics is also like everything else, like belonging. You have to take it one at a time and understand without really jeopardizing your research, but at the same time, not completely dissing out lies after lies to get access to research, but taking a somewhat moderated ethical stance. Okay. There are questions about belonging. Yes, you are right. I mean, online, the question about there is a category imposed on me. I am a Muslim woman. Both these categories have been imposed on me. Now, I might use it, I might disabuse. There are people, for example, who might say, now, tomorrow I don't belong to this religion anymore. I have given it up. So I have refused to be a part of that religion. There are so many atheists from so many different communities, Christians, Muslims, etc. Now, what do you talk about them? They don't belong anymore. They have decided not to belong. So there is a very active process of first belonging, and second, then saying that I don't belong. Or unbelonging is different. Not belonging and unbelonging, I think, are two different concepts, because unbelonging is sometimes forced upon you, that I will not let you belong. This room, this space is not for you. I will not let you belong. But I think maybe non-belonging is a little bit different, where you say, I don't want to belong. So this is just an initial thought. I'm not very sure about it, but we can think about it, because again, I go back to Nasreen's point. It cannot be a mirror image, no? So we have to think about different ways, and sometimes we have to distinguish things to make analytically more coherent points. So maybe unbelonging and non-belonging could be, I'm not sure. I just thought about it right now as I speak, talked about. Boundaries are definitely made. Now, going back to Indra's point, Indra, this is very important, that the point that you raised, that they may not be trained in history. Of course they are not. But so what do you do? Now somebody comes and tells you a story that for you might look like fantastical, not real. They may talk about ghosts, for example. Okay, what do you do with that story? Do you just throw it away because they're talking about ghosts and ghosts don't exist scientifically? Or do you take it, make meaning out of it, and make a sense out of it? What is the role that ghost is performing in that society? The figure of the ghost is performing in that society. Okay, so it may not be valid scientifically. Of course, I know historians. So right now I am in Center for Modern Indian Studies, and there are scholars here, historians here, who would say oral history is not history. I'm not a historian to make that kind of a judgment. Honestly, I am not. But I did get some little training on oral history, because I did work with people and they came with their oral histories, the caste histories, their oral caste histories. So based on the training that I received for a week, what I learned from that is definitely oral histories are very, very important. Not in exactly, you cannot say that this is truth, not in truth telling. But what are they signaling? What are they implying? Why are certain tropes important? So you have to think about those ways. And yeah, and that brings me, somebody talked about authenticity. I am saying this idea of authenticity needs to be questioned. I'm not saying it should be there. I'm saying it needs to be questioned, because we all of us in our categories, we all are researchers here. We cannot say I am the authentic voice of the community I belong to, or the community whose story I am telling. I have to reflect on my own situation as well. Maybe I have more better access. Maybe they are more confident in revealing certain things to me. If I go and talk to a Muslim person or Muslim who's facing some kind of problem with the state, they may share it with me because of my own shared Muslim identity. But that doesn't mean that, that I only have the authentic knowledge. So we have to keep questioning about the idea that only I am authentic, only my knowledge is valid. and their knowledge, because they are not trained in history or anthropology, is not valid. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that our training goes in waste in history and anthropology. We've been trained because we systematize those knowledge. Whatever knowledge we get from the field, we systematize them, we make sense of them, we make larger meanings out of them. So this is what I want to say.
Thank you, Dr. Roohi. We have two more questions in the chat box. If I could just go ahead with them. Hitesh is asking, does the conception of unbelonging, while taken as methods in juxtaposition of belonging, risk the everyday acts of negotiation through which labor migrants assert agency within precarious or the exclusionary structures? He has another question where he's asking, where do you see the agency of the displaced individual while talking about unbelonging as method? Then we have Ramzan's question, and he says he's curious about the question of belonging within a space where one identifies with it but does not feel emotionally connected. And additionally, he's asking about the concept of belonging. How does the idea of unbelonging influence migrants' perception of their identity and community, especially in places where they feel they belong, yet also question their connection? And yeah, so the notable differences in how unbelonging manifests and affects members within such communal contexts. If you will, I had a question myself.
Yes, please go ahead, Akanksha.
So since most of us are doing our field works and we've all been, I won't say we are very ethnographically trained, but we are also trying to dive into, our own dimensions and trying to see and navigate according to our own fields. I just wanted to, since I was reading your work, I just wanted to inquire, how do you navigate that tension between representing lived experience and interrogating the infrastructures that shape that interaction? So when you're in the field, you see a lot of things, you're part of it, and then you also influenced by some of it, but then there are certain things, certain nuances that shape your understanding and influence you in a very different manner. So how does one navigate it when one is in the field? What does one include and what does one exclude in that manner?
Yeah, again, very important questions. I think the answer to the first question by Hitesh is somewhat answered by Ramzan. I think Ramzan's interjection I take as more of an answer. He's providing a lot of answers to us, because I think I think it comes from a very embodied experience. His questions that you may belong to a particular what does he say, where you belong but within a space, but identify with it but do not feel emotionally connected. So you have immediately brought out the complexity of belonging. So you can identify but feel emotionally disconnected. And as I gave you the examples of, for example, take religion itself, when people just change their religion, convert to another religion, move from one religion to another, give up religion altogether. So this is just an example. You can think of with other terms as well. And so there will always be this tension, and maybe I can talk about the tension, although you have talked about something different, Akanksha, but I think it can hold also to your question. There will always be a tension between structure and agency, between infrastructures, what you call as, and between lived experiences, what you called, Akanksha. There will always be this tension. Now you are the best judge, and that is why, Ganesh, I do see some point in people doing longer ethnography, or maybe dealing with their material a little bit more long than just coming out of the field and quickly just writing it. Because when you dwell on it, when you think about it, what seemed very important then, because you were emotionally biased at that point in time, and when you come out and you think, okay, maybe I was so angry at that point in time that I only saw that, and now I see something else. Maybe I overlooked it. Maybe it is important. Like, for example, I'll tell you, when I went to the field, nobody talked about caste, okay? Or in the US. In India, everybody talked about it. But in the US, nobody talked about caste. So what does it mean? That caste is not important just because they're not talking about it? Is it not important? If I was a scholar who was not from India, who was not situated in South India or whatever, I would have taken it as a given. Okay, they don't talk about caste. Maybe it doesn't mean anything to them. But then I looked back. I took a stance back, and I started looking at the difference between what they are saying and what they are doing. And to know what they are saying and what they are doing is different will take time. So that is why sometimes a little bit longer engagement with the field will give you that difference, the gap between, okay, they say one thing, but they're doing something else. And to know what they're doing, you have to follow them for a little bit longer period. But that doesn't mean that you can't do that in 4 months. You can very much. Okay. And briefly, very briefly, okay. What is it? This risking of everyday acts of negotiation. As I said, because see, I don't have very coherent ideas. I started thinking about this whole topic only in the last 2 weeks, and it's something that you have to engage with a lot more. But Nasreen was very right in pointing out, I think this juxtaposition should not be mirroring each other. Belonging ek taraf, non-belonging ek taraf, this should not happen, because then we have to see them as categories that say a lot but also hide a lot. What is belonging telling us? It is telling us that statist ideas of belonging have some sway on us. At the end of the day, I still call myself, or even social norms, I still call myself a woman. It has a sway on me. I call myself an Indian when I am in Europe. So these imposed norms of gender, of state, etc., nationality, I am imbibing them. But at the same time, sometimes I might completely reject them, might not belong, might not feel comfortable with them, but how do I mean, so the question of what you're talking about risk, what do you see agency of the displaced individuals while talking about unbelonging? See, nobody is devoid of agency. But should we say this is again the structure agency debate in sociology. Nobody is devoid of agency. You have your agency, but how much can you exercise that agency is a question that you as a researcher should be able to understand. How much agency can I, tomorrow if my visa expires, can I experience my agency by saying, no, I will live in Germany? Can I do that? No, I can't do that. I'll be thrown out or I'll become an illegal if I want to be. So I might exercise my agency by becoming illegal. But I have to decide. So nobody is devoid of agency, but how much can they exercise their agency? How much is it constrained by structures and infrastructures? You have to keep looking at it. You have to have an eye for it. You have to keep polishing your own data, polishing your own eye, and questioning your own what you see. Don't think what you see is the truth. Tomorrow you might see something different. So keep questioning what you are seeing. And yeah, it's a lot of talk about methods, but that's what I think Vidyasagar and Akanksha wanted this talk to be. But sometimes from your marginal position, there are things that you can see that you may never have been able to see from being in a dominant position. And it is something that I want you all to think of and carry forward. And you might be in a dominant position in one place. You might come from the Northeast, and in your particular state, you might be in a dominant position. But the moment you come to Delhi or Hyderabad, you're not in a dominant position. So you are straddling a non-dominant and a dominant position all the time. So you have to know where your dominant hegemonic positions come up, where you are marginalized, where you are placed in a peripheral position, and you have to contend with it. It is a constant dialogue with yourself, with your surroundings, with your material. Let me put it this way.
Okay, so I think we don't have any more questions, so I would conclude the
I don't know
session.
why my hand is up. Okay, sorry.
So on behalf of Speaking from Margin, thank you once again, Dr. Roohi and Professor Chowdhury, for such a generous and provocative session. You've been very kind, answering all the questions and the doubts that we had. And these questions, these conversations don't end here. They ripple outward in our research, in our classrooms, and in our politics. So thank you all for joining, and we are looking forward to seeing you in our future sessions. Thank you so much. Have a very good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. It was really a pleasure seeing you all. Thank you very much.